The morning started like any other at the Hargrove Savings Branch on Elm Street. Coffee was brewing, phones were ringing, and the branch manager, a sharp-suited man named Gerald Ashton, was already seated at the head of the conference table. He had called an early staff meeting, and the agenda was simple: renovation logistics. The old storage vault in the lower level was being cleared out to make room for a modern safety deposit expansion. Gerald scanned the removal list without much thought and signed his name at the bottom. No one in the room questioned it. It all sounded like routine maintenance, the kind of paperwork that gets done and forgotten by noon. But one line on that list, a small notation next to a box number that had been active for 2 decades, was about to unravel everything Gerald Ashton had ever built. 20 years earlier, before Gerald had even joined the branch, an old farmer had walked through those same doors. His name was Earl Dawson, and he looked every bit the part: worn canvas jacket, sun-cracked boots that left faint mud prints on the polished floor, and a cap so faded its original color was anyone's guess. The employees on duty that afternoon barely looked up from their desks. To them, he was simply another customer, perhaps come to inquire about a small loan or a checking account. No one imagined that this quiet, unhurried man was about to set something in motion that would outlast most of them at that branch. Earl had asked for a safe deposit box. Not just any box, but a small, specific unit in the lower vault. The monthly rental came to $50, not an insignificant amount for a man whose livelihood depended on the weather and the price of grain. The clerk processed his paperwork with practiced efficiency and thought nothing more of it. Earl signed where he was told, collected his key, and left without offering a single word of explanation. The box was logged in the system under his name, assigned a client number, and filed alongside hundreds of others, ordinary by every measure, and yet somehow it never quite stayed that way. Month after month, Earl Dawson returned. He drove the same pickup truck, a battered old thing that had long since earned the right to retire, and he walked in with the same quiet steadiness every time. He paid his $50 at the counter, received his receipt, and was gone within minutes. The staff grew accustomed to his visits, the way one grows accustomed to the sound of rain on a familiar roof. But familiarity did little to quiet the questions that began to surface among longer-serving employees, because Earl never wavered. Not during the dry summers when crops failed and he had to sell off livestock to make ends meet. Not during the seasons when falling prices meant he was barely breaking even. He came in, he paid, and he left. Not once in 20 years did he miss a single payment. That kind of consistency is hard to ignore. New staff came and went, each generation inheriting the same whispered curiosity about the old man and his box. Some believed he had buried something worth a fortune inside, lottery winnings, perhaps, or gold he had stumbled upon decades ago. Others were convinced it held documents tied to a legal matter, something sensitive that had to be kept away from prying eyes. The theories multiplied and grew more elaborate with each retelling, the way legends tend to do when no facts are available to anchor them. There were employees who quietly mocked Earl, this weathered farmer who wore the same jacket for years yet kept spending good money on what they called a useless box. When he heard such remarks, and there is little doubt that he did, Earl only smiled. A calm, unhurried smile that gave nothing away, and then he went back to his farm as if the opinions of others held no weight in his world. Outside the bank, Earl lived a life so simple it seemed almost deliberate. A wooden farmhouse sat at the edge of a modest parcel of land that had been in his family for generations. He rose early, tended to his cattle, mended fences, and worked his small field with the kind of patience that only comes from a person who has made peace with uncertainty. The town moved around him, new roads, new buildings, new faces, but Earl remained the same. Quiet. Grounded, rooted to that land in a way that no one around him fully understood. The trouble began when Hargrove Savings announced an ambitious expansion project. The branch had outgrown its footprint, and the board had approved plans for a significant construction that would modernize the building and extend its capacity. The architectural surveys came back with a complication no one had anticipated. Earl Dawson's land, that modest, unassuming parcel of family ground, sat directly in the path of the new structure's main entrance. The design could not proceed without it. Everything halted while the management considered how to handle the problem. Gerald Ashton decided to handle it personally. He drove out to the farm on a Tuesday morning, carrying a folder of prepared contracts and what he privately considered a generous offer. In his experience, financial negotiations had a predictable rhythm: you came with a number, the other party countered, and eventually a figure was agreed upon. He had done this dozens of times. He expected the conversation with Earl to last no more than an hour. What he did not expect was the cup of coffee Earl set in front of him or the stillness of the man's expression when Gerald slid the offer across the table. Earl looked at the papers. He looked at Gerald. And then he said, simply and without any edge in his voice, that the land was not for sale. Gerald waited, certain this was an opening position. He raised the offer. Earl declined again. He raised it further. Still no. Each refusal came in the same measured tone, with no anger, no visible agitation, just a quiet firmness that Gerald found increasingly difficult to navigate. He had never sat across from someone who seemed entirely unmoved by money, and the experience unsettled him in ways he did not want to acknowledge. By the time he stood to leave, Gerald's patience had worn through entirely. He said something as he walked out, a warning thinly veiled, about what tends to happen to people who let pride get in the way of good sense. The meeting ended badly, and the drive back to the branch was a long one. Back at his desk, Gerald authorized a discreet background investigation into Earl Dawson. He told himself it was due diligence, but the truth was simpler. The old man had gotten under his skin. The investigation turned up old photographs from local residents showing Earl carrying what appeared to be document files whenever he made his bank visits. It confirmed that his safe deposit box had been continuously maintained for exactly 2 decades without a single lapse. Gerald's mind latched onto these details and began constructing a story around them. Whatever was inside that box, he concluded, held the key to the land dispute. If he could access it, the negotiation would be over before it began. His legal team raised concerns. Gerald overruled them. He was convinced the risk was manageable, and the opportunity was not. The order was given quietly, and the vault access was arranged for a Thursday morning when the branch was lightly staffed. A small group gathered in the lower storage area as the box was retrieved and placed on the examination table. There was a charged silence as the lock was cleared. For 20 years, this box had been a mystery. In a few seconds, the mystery would be over. And everyone in that room, without quite realizing it, was bracing for something extraordinary. What they found was not gold. It was not cash, not jewelry, not bearer bonds. Inside the box sat a dented tin container, a few brittle envelopes yellowed at the edges, and a compact tape recorder with a cassette still loaded inside. The room deflated almost audibly. Someone let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Others exchanged glances. 20 years of speculation, and this was what Earl Dawson had guarded with such devotion. A tin box and some old tapes. The joke started almost immediately, quiet at first, then emboldened by shared laughter. It seemed the old farmer had spent 2 decades protecting nothing at all. Then the bank's security system came online. The alarm did not blare the way it does when a door is forced. It was a different kind of alert, the kind built into the vault's deepest protocols, triggered not by physical intrusion but by the unauthorized access of a flagged asset. Within the same minute, an automated signal was dispatched to a federal oversight division. The sound of sirens reached the branch parking lot before most employees had even processed what was happening. Federal agents entered the building 12 minutes after the box was opened. The lead investigator walked into the storage room, took one look at the tin container on the table, and went very still. What was inside those yellowed envelopes was not the private sentiment of an old farmer. It was a collection of legally executed documents bearing signatures that had not been seen outside certain government archives in over 2 decades. Among the names on those pages was a former head of state and the founding chairman of Hargrove Savings himself. The room that had been full of nervous laughter moments earlier was now completely silent. The documents told a story that predated the bank's current management by a generation. Earl Dawson had not always been just a farmer. Decades ago, he had performed a significant service in a military capacity, the nature of which the documents made clear without elaborating on, and in recognition of that service, the land had been formally transferred to him by official executive order. It was not a gift, not a handshake deal, not a verbal promise. It was a legally recorded transfer, witnessed and verified, signed at the highest level. The tape recorder carried the rest of the story. Years after that transfer, the founding chairman of Hargrove Savings had found himself in a severe financial position. The bank he had built was on the edge of collapse. Earl, without being asked and without condition, had allowed his land to serve as collateral to stabilize the institution purely out of loyalty to a man he considered a friend. In exchange, a formal protection agreement had been drawn up and signed by all parties involved. That agreement stated clearly and without ambiguity that Earl Dawson's assets, including that land, were to be permanently shielded from any form of pressure, coercion, or forced acquisition. The cassette tape contained the recorded proceedings of that agreement. Every word, every commitment, every promise. The federal investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Agents reviewed the bank's internal records, communications, and authorization logs. What they found went well beyond the matter of the safe deposit box. There were documented abuses of authority, systematic violations of customer asset protocols, and evidence that internal information had been suppressed to facilitate the expansion project. Gerald Ashton, who had signed the removal order that morning without a second thought, now sat in a conference room answering questions he had never anticipated. The board revoked his credentials before the end of the week. He was removed from all positions and placed under formal investigation. The man who had walked into that branch every morning as its highest authority was now its most prominent liability. The expansion project was canceled entirely. The investments made in preparation for it, planning costs, contractor agreements, architectural fees, became losses that the bank could not absorb quietly. Within days, the story had reached the media. The coverage was not kind. Stock values dropped sharply. Institutional partners who had been aligned with the bank began to distance themselves publicly. The branch that had once looked at Earl Dawson's land as an obstacle to its ambitions was now fighting to remain operational at all. Gerald did not go quietly. Even after losing his position, after the investigation had made the full scope of his decisions a matter of public record, he drove out to Earl's farm one last time. He arrived at the property with something that still resembled composure and told Earl that the situation was not beyond repair, that everything in his view still came down to price, that if Earl named a number, all of it could be put behind them. He said it with the certainty of a man who had spent a career believing that money was the final word in any conversation. Earl was quiet for a long moment. He looked out over his land, the fence line his father had built, the field where he and his late wife had planted their first crop together, the soil that held more memory than most buildings ever would. Then he spoke. He said he had never wanted a dollar from that bank, that the land was not a number waiting to be written down. It was the place where he and his wife had built their first home, where they had worked side by side, where the happiest years of his life had taken root and grown. Some things, Earl said, are not refused because the price is too low. They are not for sale because they were never meant to be. Gerald left without another word. There was nothing left to say. The box that had sat quietly in the vault for 20 years had not contained gold or cash or any of the things people had imagined. What it had contained was a promise, kept faithfully, paid for month after month with $50 and unwavering patience, by a man who understood that some things in this life hold a value that cannot be negotiated away. And in the end, that promise had held. While everything built on pressure and assumption collapsed around it, the promise had simply stood, as it always had, as it always would.